Welcome to Whispers After Midnight. Tonight, we dive deep into one of the most horrifying true stories in American history, the Goler Family Nightmare. A century of darkness, secrecy, and unspeakable acts comes to light in 1984. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe. We've spent countless hours uncovering every chilling detail of this true story just for you. The story of the Goler family begins in the remote, rugged mountains of Nova Scotia, Canada, where isolation shaped their lives in ways that would later become shocking to the world. Generations of the Goler family lived deep in the wilderness, miles away from towns, schools, and neighbors. Life in this secluded environment was harsh and unforgiving. The mountain terrain was difficult to traverse, winters were bitterly cold, and survival often depended on self-reliance and the few resources available within the family. Over time, this isolation allowed the Goler family to develop their own closed-off society. Outsiders rarely ventured into their territory, and the family had little contact with the broader community. With minimal oversight from local authorities or social institutions, the Goler household became a microcosm of secrecy, where norms and moral boundaries that most of society took for granted no longer applied. The origins of the family's dysfunction can be traced back to this combination of remoteness and generational isolation. Living cut off from schools, neighbors, and social structures meant that knowledge of proper parenting, social etiquette, and basic human rights was virtually non-existent. The children were raised in extreme solitude, relying entirely on the family for guidance, sustenance, and survival. This environment not only reinforced the family's insularity, but also allowed disturbing patterns of behavior, like inbreeding and abusive practices, to go unnoticed and unchallenged for decades. By the time outsiders began to take notice, the Goler family had already established a deeply entrenched, multi-generational cycle of abuse and secrecy. Understanding their origins is crucial because it reveals how the environment they lived in, remote, unforgiving, and isolated, created the perfect conditions for a dark legacy that would eventually horrify the world. As the Goler family grew in the isolated mountains of Nova Scotia, early signs of dysfunction began to emerge, signs that would later shock investigators and the public alike. One of the most disturbing aspects of the family's history was the pattern of inbreeding that had been taking place for generations. Because the family lived so cut off from the outside world, marriages and relationships occurred almost exclusively within the family unit itself. Cousins married cousins, siblings had children together, and over time, the genetic consequences of this insularity became tragically evident. The effects of inbreeding weren't just biological, they also amplified psychological and social dysfunction. Children born into these relationships often exhibited developmental delays, physical deformities, and mental health issues. At the same time, the lack of exposure to the outside world meant that normal social behaviors, moral boundaries, and emotional intelligence were rarely modeled or learned. Discipline was harsh or non-existent, education was minimal or self-taught, and the family operated by its own strict and twisted rules, handed down over generations. Even neighbors in nearby communities began to notice that something was off about the Goler household. Rumors of abnormal behavior, strange family dynamics, and unusual living conditions began to circulate. Yet, because the family lived so far away and was so wary of outsiders, it remained largely insulated from any intervention. The secrecy and fear of outsiders only strengthened the cycle of dysfunction. By the time law enforcement became involved decades later, it was clear that the family's problems were not sudden or isolated. They were the product of decades of neglect, abuse, and generational inbreeding. Understanding these early signs is essential because it shows that the darkness surrounding the Goler family didn't appear overnight. It was a slow, tragic evolution of isolation, secrecy, and twisted familial bonds that eventually culminated in one of the most shocking criminal cases in Canadian history. Even in a remote area, whispers travel fast, and the Goler family was no exception. Neighbors and townspeople had long been suspicious of the family's strange, secretive ways. The Golers rarely interacted with outsiders, and when they did, their behavior often struck others as bizarre or unsettling. Children were rarely seen in public, adults avoided regular social gatherings, and the family lived in a chaotic, deteriorating house that seemed almost frozen in time. Rumors began circulating about the Golers' lifestyle, many of them fueled by hearsay and speculation. Some neighbors spoke of children being neglected or malnourished, while others hinted at unusual relationships and forbidden activities within the household. People reported seeing bizarre family dynamics, children cowering under the authority of older relatives, and adults treating each other with a mix of aggression and dominance. These stories painted a picture of a household unlike any other, one that was shrouded in secrecy and fear. Despite the suspicions, most outsiders felt powerless to intervene. The family's remote location and the fearsome reputation they had cultivated over decades made it difficult for anyone to approach or question them directly. Local authorities had little insight into what was happening inside the home, and social services at the time were stretched thin, particularly in rural areas. The combination of isolation, fear, and secrecy allowed the rumors to grow, creating an almost mythical aura of dread around the family. This period of suspicion and rumor was critical because it set the stage for what would later become a full-scale investigation. When the truth finally emerged, it shocked the nation, but for those living nearby, the disturbing whispers had already hinted at a reality far darker than anyone wanted to admit. The community's unease was a warning sign, a signal that something deeply unnatural was unfolding behind closed doors in the Goler household. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Goler family story was the extreme neglect endured by the children. Growing up in the isolated mountains of Nova Scotia, the Golers' youngest generations were effectively trapped in a world cut off from basic human care, education, and social development. Parents, themselves products of the same abusive cycle, offered little guidance or affection. Children were left to fend for themselves, scavenging for food, warmth, and attention in a household that was chaotic and dangerous. Their living conditions were appalling. Rooms were often overcrowded, unsanitary, and poorly heated during brutal Canadian winters. The children had minimal access to clothing, medical care, or proper nutrition, leading to stunted growth, frequent illness, and malnourishment. Education was almost non-existent. Few of the children attended school, and most were illiterate, unable to communicate effectively with anyone outside their immediate family. But perhaps the most damaging element was the lack of exposure to the outside world. The Golers were intensely secretive, fearful of outsiders discovering their twisted family dynamics. Children rarely ventured beyond the mountains, and contact with neighbors or other members of society was severely limited. This isolation meant that the children had no role models for normal social behavior, moral boundaries, or emotional health. What they learned instead were the distorted rules and taboos of the Goler household, including patterns of violence, manipulation, and incestuous relationships. This upbringing left long-lasting psychological scars. Many of the children grew up confused about right and wrong, unable to form healthy relationships, and trapped in cycles of abuse. By the time authorities uncovered the family's crimes, it became painfully clear that the horror experienced by the children was not an isolated incident. It was the natural result of decades of generational neglect and a lifetime of growing up in a world dominated by fear and secrecy. Perhaps the most horrifying and central element of the Goler family's story was the pervasive pattern of incest that spanned generations. In a family isolated from society, with little to no external oversight, relationships that would normally be taboo became normalized. Siblings married siblings, cousins had children together, and parents often exploited their own children. Over time, these incestuous patterns became an ingrained part of the family's culture, a destructive cycle that was repeated again and again, generation after generation. The consequences were both physical and psychological. Many children born into these relationships suffered from genetic abnormalities, developmental delays, and chronic illnesses, but the trauma extended far beyond the physical. Growing up in a home where abuse and exploitation were normalized warped the children's understanding of love, trust, and family bonds. They were taught that control, dominance, and secrecy were the rules of life, and that the outside world could not be trusted. The family's incestuous behavior wasn't always hidden entirely from the community. Some neighbors suspected or even witnessed inappropriate relationships, but fear of retaliation, coupled with the Goler's remote location, prevented intervention. The secrecy of the household meant that even as the pattern of abuse became more severe, it went largely undetected, a horrifying testament to how isolation and fear can allow depravity to flourish unchecked. By the time law enforcement became aware of the situation in 1984, the extent of the family's incestuous relationships was staggering. Investigators were confronted with multi-generational abuse that had become so normalized within the family that victims often did not even recognize it as wrong. This entrenched cycle of incest wasn't just a symptom of isolation. It was a key factor in the family's dark, destructive legacy, a chilling reminder of how extreme seclusion and neglect can create conditions for unimaginable abuse. The shocking truth about the Goler family did not come to light overnight. It was a slow unraveling, triggered in the early 1980s, that exposed decades of abuse, neglect, and inbreeding to the outside world. The discovery began when neighbors, long suspicious of the family's strange behavior, finally reported concerns to local authorities. Unusual patterns, children wandering alone, signs of malnourishment, and the eerie secrecy surrounding the household prompted law enforcement to investigate more closely. When authorities first entered the Goler household, they were met with scenes that were almost unimaginable. The interior of the home reflected decades of neglect, cluttered, unsanitary, and in disrepair. Children were found living in conditions that defied basic standards of care, many malnourished and clothed in tattered garments. Investigators quickly realized that these conditions were not temporary lapses, but the culmination of years of systemic neglect. But the physical environment was only part of the horror. As authorities began questioning family members, a grim picture emerged of a household dominated by control, secrecy, and generational abuse. Incestuous relationships were rampant, and many children displayed the psychological scars of prolonged trauma. Anxiety, fear, and confusion about family bonds were evident in almost every young person they encountered. Older family members often showed a hardened detachment, having themselves been raised under the same abusive conditions. This discovery shocked not only law enforcement but also the wider Canadian public. What had been dismissed for decades as rumors and whispers was now irrefutable. The Goler family had been living in extreme isolation while perpetuating cycles of abuse that spanned generations. The early 1980s investigation marked the beginning of a larger legal and social reckoning, exposing a nightmare that had festered in the mountains for over a century. Once the authorities were alerted to the Goler family's situation in the early 1980s, what began as a routine welfare check quickly escalated into a full-scale criminal investigation. Law enforcement officers were unprepared for the sheer scope of what they were about to uncover. The Goler household was far more than a neglected family home. It was the epicenter of decades of abuse, incest, and cruelty, hidden from the outside world by isolation and fear. Investigators were immediately confronted with evidence that spanned multiple generations. Children living in squalor, adults who had normalized abusive behaviors, and a pattern of incestuous relationships that defied belief all pointed to a deeply entrenched system of familial control. Each new interview, each room inspected, revealed more shocking details. Officers discovered that many of the family members had never received proper medical care, education, or social guidance. Physical and psychological scars were everywhere, painting a picture of systematic, long-term abuse. One of the most chilling aspects of the investigation was the sheer normalization of the abuse within the family. Victims often did not recognize that what they had endured was wrong. They saw their lives through the distorted lens of the family's twisted rules, which made interviewing and gathering evidence extremely challenging. Law enforcement had to navigate not only the legal complexities of the crimes, but also the psychological manipulation and fear that permeated the household. The revelations sent shockwaves through the local community and beyond. For decades, the Goler family had hidden in plain sight, cloaked by the isolation of the mountains and the secrecy they maintained so carefully. But now, the nightmare that had defined their lives was finally exposed. Investigators realized they were dealing with a family whose crimes were as much a product of systemic neglect as individual malice. A haunting case that would leave a permanent mark on Canadian social history. Following the shocking revelations uncovered during the investigation, authorities moved swiftly to bring the Goler family members to justice. Multiple arrests were made, targeting both the adults who had perpetuated the cycle of abuse and those complicit in the family's dark secrets. The charges ranged from child neglect and sexual abuse to incest and endangerment, reflecting the breadth and depth of the crimes that had gone unnoticed for decades. The arrests sent ripples through the local community. Neighbors who had long whispered suspicions were stunned to see law enforcement taking decisive action. The magnitude of the case, involving several generations of a single family, was almost unprecedented in Canadian history. Many of the adult family members showed little outward remorse, having been raised under the same twisted rules they now enforced on their own children. Meanwhile, some younger members of the family were caught in the legal net despite being victims themselves, illustrating the complex, intergenerational nature of the abuse. The process of filing charges and preparing for court was complicated by the psychological and emotional trauma the victims had endured. Many of the children and teenagers were reluctant to testify or even speak about their experiences, having been conditioned to fear authority and protect the family's secrets. Law enforcement and social workers had to carefully navigate these sensitivities to ensure the safety and well-being of the victims, while securing the evidence needed for prosecution. Ultimately, the arrests marked a turning point in the Goler family saga. For the first time, the long, hidden horrors of the household were being formally acknowledged by the law. The legal action against the family not only sought justice for the immediate victims, but also shone a light on the broader societal failures, neglect, isolation, and a lack of oversight that had allowed such abuse to persist for generations. The Goler case would go on to become a landmark example of how systemic neglect and family secrecy can hide horrors far worse than anyone could imagine. Once the Goler family members were arrested, the legal proceedings became a national spectacle, exposing a dark legacy that had been hidden for decades. The court trials revealed in painstaking detail the full extent of the family's crimes, from generational incest to extreme child neglect, physical abuse, and psychological manipulation. The courtroom became a window into the horrifying reality that had been concealed behind the mountains for generations. During the trials, prosecutors presented extensive evidence, including testimonies from victims, medical reports, and social worker accounts. Witnesses recounted experiences that were almost impossible to imagine: children forced to live in squalor, relationships twisted by abuse, and the normalization of acts that society deemed unconscionable. Each revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom and the wider public, who struggled to reconcile the image of a family with the horrifying truths being laid bare. The media coverage amplified the impact of the trials. Newspapers, radio, and television documented the story in detail, portraying the Golers as one of the most notorious examples of familial abuse in Canadian history. While some reporters sensationalized aspects of the story, much of the coverage focused on the systemic failures that allowed such conditions to persist. Audiences were horrified to learn that a family could live in extreme isolation, perpetuate cycles of abuse, and remain largely unchecked for decades. The trials also highlighted the complexities of dealing with intergenerational abuse legally. Many family members were both perpetrators and victims, creating difficult moral and legal dilemmas for the courts. The case became a landmark in Canadian legal history, demonstrating the need for more vigilant social services, stricter oversight of isolated communities, and a better understanding of how abuse can perpetuate across generations. Ultimately, the courtroom exposure of the Goler family's dark secrets brought long overdue justice and public awareness. It forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about isolation, neglect, and the consequences of turning a blind eye to those living on the margins, lessons that remain relevant to this day. The Goler family's horrifying legacy extended far beyond physical neglect and abuse. Its psychological impact on the surviving children and victims was profound and long-lasting. Many of the children grew up in an environment where fear, manipulation, and secrecy were constant companions. They were taught to obey without question, to hide the truth from outsiders, and to accept as normal behaviors that were deeply abusive. This conditioning left deep emotional scars that would persist long after they were removed from the household. Survivors often exhibited severe trauma, including anxiety, depression, and difficulty forming trusting relationships. The isolation and generational abuse meant that they lacked basic social skills and had never experienced healthy parental guidance. Many struggled with identity issues, shame, and confusion over family roles, as the lines between love, control, and abuse had been deliberately blurred by their caretakers. For some, memories of neglect, hunger, and exploitation continued to haunt them into adulthood, influencing every aspect of their lives. Psychologists and social workers, who later worked with the children, emphasized the uniqueness and severity of the trauma. Unlike typical cases of abuse, the Goler children had been trapped in a system that normalized their suffering for decades. They had little understanding of what a normal family looked like, and escaping the psychological chains of their upbringing required years of therapy, patience, and careful intervention. The impact also rippled through siblings, cousins, and even extended family members. Patterns of distrust, aggression, and fear often carried over into relationships outside the household. Even after legal intervention, many survivors needed ongoing support to rebuild their sense of self and develop the social and emotional tools that had been systematically denied to them. Understanding the psychological impact on the victims is crucial because it illustrates that the horrors of the Goler family were not just physical or legal issues, they were deeply human tragedies. The emotional and mental scars left by decades of neglect and abuse serve as a haunting reminder of the long-term consequences of isolation, secrecy, and systemic failure. The horrors of the Goler family did not exist in a vacuum. While isolation and secrecy played a huge role, systemic failures in social services and societal neglect were also critical factors that allowed the abuse to persist for decades. In rural Nova Scotia, oversight was minimal, resources were limited, and families living in remote areas often went unchecked. The Golers exploited this gap, hiding in plain sight while engaging in practices that would have been immediately reported in more connected communities. Social services at the time were stretched thin and often reactive rather than proactive. While neighboring communities had noticed signs of neglect, malnourished children, unsanitary living conditions, and unusual family dynamics, there was little formal follow-up. Many reports were dismissed or delayed due to bureaucratic limitations, geographic challenges, or the assumption that rural families should handle their affairs independently. This lack of intervention created a perfect environment for abuse to escalate unchecked. Moreover, societal attitudes contributed to the prolonged neglect. Neighbors whispered rumors but hesitated to act directly, fearing retaliation or misjudging the severity of the situation. There was a general lack of awareness about the dynamics of generational abuse, inbreeding, and psychological manipulation, meaning that even those who suspected wrongdoing often did not know how to report or intervene effectively. When social services finally became involved during the 1980s investigation, they were confronted with decades worth of neglect and trauma. Workers found children who had been deprived of basic needs, education, and emotional nurturing. The system had failed to detect or prevent abuse, highlighting how a combination of isolation, fear, and institutional gaps can allow horrific conditions to persist undisturbed. The Goler case ultimately became a sobering example of how societal neglect and systemic failures can amplify the suffering of vulnerable populations. It underscores the importance of vigilant social oversight, community accountability, and early intervention in preventing abuse. Lessons that resonate far beyond the remote mountains where the Golers lived. The Goler family case left an indelible mark on Canadian history, not only as one of the most shocking instances of generational abuse and neglect, but also as a cautionary tale about the consequence of isolation and societal neglect. Even decades after the family's crimes were exposed, the story continues to resonate because it illustrates how hidden tragedies can fester when communities and institutions fail to intervene. The case has become a reference point for understanding the dangers of extreme familial isolation. It revealed how a combination of remote living, secrecy, and fear can allow abusive practices to go unnoticed for generations. For sociologists, psychologists, and social workers, the Golers' story provides a stark example of the long-term effects of intergenerational abuse, neglect, and inbreeding, highlighting the psychological, social, and biological consequences that such conditions produce. In the media and public imagination, the Goler family became synonymous with horror hidden in plain sight. Documentaries, news articles, and books have revisited the case repeatedly, ensuring that its lessons remain part of the collective memory. The case also sparked discussions about improving social services, rural oversight, and child protection systems to prevent similar tragedies from occurring. Perhaps most importantly, the legacy of the Goler family serves as a reminder of resilience. Despite the unimaginable conditions in which they were raised, many survivors have gone on to rebuild their lives, seek therapy, and speak out about their experiences. Their courage underscores the human capacity to overcome even the most deeply entrenched cycles of abuse. The Goler family story remains a chilling chapter in Canadian history, but it also serves as a powerful lesson. Society cannot ignore the signs of abuse, isolation, or neglect, no matter how remote or insular a family may seem. It reminds us that vigilance, compassion, and intervention are crucial in protecting the most vulnerable. The Goler Family Nightmare is more than a story of horror. It is a case study in the consequences of unchecked isolation, systemic failure, and intergenerational abuse. After the family's crimes were exposed, communities, social workers, and law enforcement agencies across Canada began to reflect on what went wrong and how similar tragedies could be prevented in the future. One of the key lessons is the critical importance of early intervention. The Goler children suffered for decades because warning signs were ignored or underestimated. Reports from neighbors were sporadic, and social services were under-resourced and unprepared to handle the complexity of such cases. Today, the case underscores why vigilant monitoring of vulnerable families, even in remote areas, is essential to prevent abuse from becoming entrenched. Another lesson lies in understanding the psychological effects of long-term neglect and abuse. Generational trauma, like that seen in the Goler family, does not only affect physical well-being but also distorts emotional development, social behavior, and mental health. Modern social services and mental health professionals now have a more nuanced awareness of how abuse can perpetuate across generations. And the Goler case serves as a powerful example of these dynamics. The story also sparks ongoing societal discussions about isolation and community responsibility. When families live cut off from the broader society, they can create insular systems that normalize harmful behavior. It highlights how communities must balance respect for privacy with vigilance to ensure that children and vulnerable individuals are protected. Finally, the Goler family serves as a reminder that systemic failures, be they in law enforcement, social services, or community awareness, can allow horrors to persist far longer than they should. The case encourages ongoing reforms, better training for social workers, and public awareness campaigns to help communities identify and report abuse. In the end, the lessons of the Goler Family Nightmare are both chilling and instructive. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human behavior, societal responsibility, and the delicate balance between isolation and oversight. Most importantly, it reminds us that awareness, intervention, and compassion are the first lines of defense in preventing abuse and protecting the most vulnerable among us.